I guess just as a preface too, I have a few slides to share with you. I homeschool my daughters using a classical model, and then I also co-founded a classical after-school program that works with lower-income African-American children. So the context where I work is looking at bringing together the African-American tradition and classical schooling. And so I'm just going to share with you some of my thoughts about how to bring those two together. All right, so what I see are kind of three different perspectives on how these relate to each other. The first is the idea of the Western classical tradition and African-American experience being separate. The second is an active examination of African and other non-European peoples in the classical world. And a third is thinking in terms of a dialogue between the Black intellectual tradition and Western classics. And so I'm going to go through each of those briefly. So with the first perspective, the idea is that the focus is generally on studying Western history, philosophy, and literature without reference to non-European peoples, right? And the African and African-American experience are seen as unconnected, right? So that would be one of the most basic approaches. This gets into the second approach. I'm sorry, the title is cut off, but this is one where you're thinking about African and non-European peoples in the classical world and in the ancient world. And this map, it's hard to make out, but this is the world according to Herodotus. And what you would be able to see, if you could see closely, is you have Europe at the top there, and then you have kind of the Mediterranean in the middle, and then you've got a huge swath of Africa that's labeled as Libya and Ethiopia, because Ethiopia was often stood in kind of for much of the continent. And you have Arabia and Asia. Right? So just thinking about how Herodotus and his writings, you certainly have people who are non-European. Also, just to build on that map and thinking about some of the classical writers and where were non-European peoples. So this is from a book called Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, written by a classicist, a professional classicist. And what she does in this book, it's incredibly helpful, is she's combed through all of this classical writing, looking specifically where there are mentions of non-European peoples, from India, from the Middle East, from Africa, and so on. And so I've just excerpted a few of them. So this first one is from the Odyssey, where Menelaus describes to Telemachus his journey home from the Trojan War, and you see some of the different places that he traveled to. So this is just saying, you know, certainly it was on the consciousness of people writing at the time. This next quote is a really interesting one from Pliny the Elder from Natural Histories. And I won't read through the whole thing, you can read it, but I'll just kind of summarize. It's very interesting. So many of the writers in the ancient world, they had this kind of environmental theory about why peoples looked the way they did. And so Ethiopians, they saw as being very dark because of the sun. But then you'll notice he talks about very light-colored people who were white, and he puts those at polar opposites, and he doesn't see either of them as ideal. You know, so the people who are white are wild, and then the people who are darker are lackluster. And the ideal people are the people in the middle. So more kind of the Mediterranean, you'll see they are the ones that he sees have gentle customs, right? And so it's, you know, it's very interesting because in our context, we, you know, often white is going to be the better and black is going to be the worst, but that's not, you know, that's not necessarily the case for what Pliny is seeing is, well, it's the people in the middle who are best, and he's working off of this kind of environmental theory, right? So again, it just gives us kind of sociologically a sense of they were trying to figure this out and see, you know, how do people come to be different? And then the last one I'll share with you, this is from Herodotus' Histories, where he's making the case that the Greeks borrowed some of their clothing from the Libyans in North Africa, right? So this is, you know, kind of an alternative approach of looking at where were the places of African and other non-European peoples in the thinking of Western Europeans. Then the last approach, and again, the top is cut off, but this is that final approach of the Black intellectual tradition in dialogue with the Western classics. And so for this one, particularly in the context of the United States, the dominance of classical education in pre and post emancipation, that was the kind of education that you were often going to get if you were going to get an education. So for African Americans pre-emancipation who were struggling to get an education, this is typically what they were going to be getting, right? So what you find is some very creative Black intellectual engagement with the Western classics. You also find a lot of intellectual and artistic innovation. So that is not just, kind of mimicking what Western classics is doing, but creatively and critically engaging with that tradition, innovating on it, and so on. And what the last point is that by teaching a kind of dialogue between the Black intellectual tradition and Western classics, you really get to weave together a study of both. And so you're looking at Black literature, artistic traditions, and you're looking at how they've been in dialogue with the Western classical tradition for hundreds of years in very innovative ways. So just a couple of examples. Phyllis Wheatley, who is a classical prodigy, really, and she's the first published African-American poet in the United States. Really fascinating. So that's one kind of figure that would be an example of what I'm talking about. Another, of course, is Frederick Douglass, who really learned oratory studying the kind of classical rhetoric that was in vogue at the time and really self-educated. And one of the things that was in the Columbian Orator, which he studied very intensively, was this dialogue between a master and a slave. Now, this was not meant for Black people to be reading, but this is what he was reading. And as he's looking at this dialogue, he said, it is teaching him about freedom and ideas of freedom and yearning for freedom. And he talks about how it opened up his soul to be able to read and to really think through issues of liberation and freedom. And the last example I'll give you is Romare Bearden's Black Odyssey, which Danielle introduced me to a number of years ago and I've used in my program in the community. Romare Bearden is a 20th century Black artist who has this really brilliant kind of Black reinterpretation of the Odyssey. And so I've used that in my program in the community. And I've also, this year, we went through the Greek myths, and I commissioned a young African-American artist to do a creative reinterpretation of the Greek gods and goddesses as African-American. And I have examples of that I'll pass around in just a moment. And so we read through the Greek myths, and then we used these images of the different gods and goddesses to prompt the children to write poetry based on what they knew of these different figures. So this is what I think of as a kind of a third approach to thinking about a dialogue back and forth. When I say the Black intellectual tradition, there is this very serious tradition of Black scholarship and inquiry and writing that is in its own sense, another tradition that's very important. And I'm aware I'm only focusing on the African American tradition, and that's mostly because that's where I am standing and that's who I am working with. I know people are working with very diverse populations, but at least this gives you kind of one approach that, three different approaches for this particular population. So I will pass these little booklets around. Feel free to take a look at what the kids have done.